Okay, so where was I? The monarch casts wine posture is a chained context posture, so it's compounding two movements. One is pulling straight back, and then the next one is going straight forward, at least in this version. And I can tell you that in this version, the lead hand is dominant. It's brace farley, so it's like we've got our hand on someone else's arm with our lead arm. We'll be pulling with both hands, but the lead hand is dominant, and that's pulling someone towards us. And you don't have to pull this funny face like you're going to the toilet, but what you do have to do is think about what's the second context here. So we're using sink, but what's it being combined with? Well, it's open, but it looks a little bit different to how we would normally think about open. So if we think about the flip the pancake posture, which uses a conventional form of open, the lead leg lifts up into the pivot root and the lead hip is moving away from the rear hip. But remember, in previous videos I said open can be the lead hip moving away from the rear hip or the rear hip moving away from the lead hip. As long as the quad is opening, it's open. And in this case, the rear hip is moving away from the lead hip. So it's a mirrored version of open. And this is because when you pull someone directly towards you, everything flips around. It's the perfect example of what we mean by mirroring contexts. And this is one of those things that actually isn't that hard to understand physically once you get it, but it makes it seem much more complex than it really is when you try and explain it. But we do need to understand it, because if you try to work out how to stack the postures, or even worse, you try to just do it intuitively, you'll just do it the way that you're used to doing it, which is the unmirrored way of doing it, because that's what you normally practice, and you'll think that that's intuitive. You won't be able to work out why it isn't working or what the problem is. So let's start with what we do know. When we normally do a lead hand posture with gap farley, i.e. a punch, elbow, palm strike, we use a standard version of open where the lead hip moves away from the rear hip. And we can see that physically in the posture. It uses rise as well, and so when we use a rear hand gap farley strike, we use rise but with close. But now imagine that we put our hand behind someone else's head and we want to use brace farley to pull them directly towards us. We would have to work out which context we use here, and we might think, well, do we use the B context because it's brace farley, or is it a little bit like a hook where we still use the A context? Or as we play around with the posture, trying it in different ways, we might think, well, what would happen if we use close? How would that change the dynamics of the posture? And believe me, it will. It will not just change the dynamics of the posture, it will change the dynamics of how you move the other person. So all of this is about logical problem solving, just like Wang Xiangjai told us to do. And when we do solve the problem, what we're going to find is that the solution is that we use open, but it's the kind of open where the rear hip goes away from the lead hip. But that solution would take some finding, because for most people I think you would intuitively use close, because as we'll see in a moment, that feels like a stronger posture, and this posture feels like a weaker posture. It's not intuitive at all. Or rather, it would be if you were doing something like tug of war, where you had no choice but to pull someone straight back towards you, then you would intuitively do this. But if you have a choice, like if you're just practicing on the air or with a punch bag or with a partner, intuitively what you'll go for is the strongest version of the posture, which is to pull someone over to the side, i.e. to use close, and in this case pull them over to your left side. The only reason you would ever pull straight back is if you had to. For example, if you were playing tug of war, the nature of the game would cause you to pull back in this way, and you can see, even though this is an AI generated image, you can imagine yourself playing tug of war and you would use this posture. You would use open from the rear hip moving away from the lead hip. And if, for example, it was a fixed object like the opposition team pulling against you, so you couldn't change the direction of that force, but you changed to use close, you would just pull yourself towards them. So if you were in a kind of clinch position and you pull them using close, all you're really doing is pulling your faces together. You're not actually doing any kind of useful posture. And again, even from the AI generated image, you can see this is the posture that you would use to pull yourself towards them, or you use it to climb up a wall if you're strong enough or something like that. So it's quite interesting how the principles of Chinese physical culture help us understand all different kinds of movement. It's genuinely the science of Chinese physical culture. And there is a reason why you change the way that you use open when you pull back. So you change from lead hip moves away from rear hip to rear hip moves away from lead hip. I'll maybe look at that another time, but if we get into the weeds of all of that, it will totally distract us with something that's quite confusing to explain. So for now, we can just say that when you pull back, you're going in the opposite direction, all the contexts mirror. And secondly, you can just think about it intuitively. For example, if you were doing tug of war, you would just feel, well, obviously if you're going backwards, you've got to open the qua to the back like that so that you can pull effectively. What I really want to address is this issue that emerges in the Chinese martial arts discussion space regularly about the relationships or differences between push hands and wrestling. And you can modify push hands infinitely creatively, and you should do, to create different kinds of training paradigms, obviously. But push hands isn't wrestling. But that's not the same thing as saying that you shouldn't do wrestling or stand-up grappling training. It's a technical discussion. And the foundation of that discussion is understanding that most of these postures are stacked in such a way that they will be quite useless for wrestling. They just don't give you enough of your, or maximise enough of your bodily strength to allow you to, for example, pull someone's whole weight back. And this is why, for example, when someone's quite good at push hands, but then they get into a bit of a wrestling match, then all of a sudden their push hand skills just look like garbage. That's not what the push hand skills are for. If you try and wrestle with them, you will look like garbage. And to explain that in really straightforward, visible terms, I've got this sandbag. It's the heaviest sandbag that they've got at the gym, and it's much heavier than any weight that I would normally pull if I was using these kinds of push hands or guard breaking techniques. And it's still nowhere near as heavy as someone of my equal size and strength resisting. But because of that extra weight, it's going to really amplify the effects of the weaknesses of the structure and the posture when you try and use it against a heavy weight like this. So we'll be able to see it really clearly. And one of the things to bear in mind is if the weight is this heavy, actually when I pull it back towards me, I'm partly pulling myself towards the weight itself. So it negates part of the posture, just like we talked about in terms of tug of war. And that's going to be really clear in the way that it affects my structure. So the first thing to notice is that the bag pulls me right off my root. It pulls me forward. And even though just looking at it, it looks relatively stable, like I just had to take a little corrective step, but actually that's not how it felt. And then the second time I do it, you can really see I can't contain the energy, and it just pulls me right off my root. And the thing is, if you try and control it on the spot, you only make it worse. So in the third one, I really try my best, and it looks like I am controlling it. See, I don't take a step, it doesn't pull me forwards, but I could feel in my own posture that it was completely unbalanced. If anyone had just pushed me at that moment, I would have gone flying. Now, when I change the other way around, I can control it much better because I'm naturally left-handed, so I'm not stronger that way. It's just the way that the intent links in with the whole structure is better in terms of the way that you're dominant-handed. So you can get around this issue a little bit in terms of building strength, in terms of working on cultivation, but nevertheless, I'm telling you, I could feel it in my structure that this is a weak posture. At that point where I'm pulling back, I'm pulling myself right off my feet. And if someone were to just counter push me at that point, then I'd be screwed. And this is why, except as an occasional exercise, fixed step push hands just isn't for me. It encourages people to think that there's something that you can develop in your upper body that will somehow counteract the fundamental laws of physics, and there isn't. But because people are trapped particularly in that competition and training format, that's when you start faking it. So I think that's where a lot of the kind of woo stuff comes from, because there's no other solution to that problem. And what you end up with is something that just looks like really bad wrestling. And the reason for that is that the solution, the real solution, is to use footwork to move yourself around to compensate for that, not stay. Why would you ever just stay fixed on one spot? The only reason is because people are caught in that ideology of thinking that there's something that you can develop, some kind of chi or magic power that you will develop, and then people start searching for it. Actually, the real solution number one, is to use footwork to move around and to train that, integrate it with your Farley. And I know that people say, well, it helps you understand where your posture is weak, but if you hit me hard enough, I'm weak in every direction. But if you look at everything from a completely different perspective, so first of all, you let go of the idea of wrestling, not completely, I mean train wrestling, but let go of the idea of wrestling in terms of push hands, and you let go of the idea of fixed step push hands so that you can move around, then there's an area of explosive movement where you don't need to massively move all of your opponent's weight. You can just move a limb, you can just push them when they're off balance, and you don't need your maximum strength. And if you can, just suddenly infect their structure so that they don't brace against the punch and you hit them in that moment, it has a force magnification effect. So if we train for that and we exploit that area where it's not about having more physical strength than the other person, it's not about opposing all of their physical strength with all of your physical strength. It's just about hitting them when they're off balanced, when they're not braced, and just using a short, sharp, explosive movement and using your footwork to make that the best possible combination of elements to get the result that you want. Setting yourself free from all of these fixed paradigms. But that takes thought. So remember I said that most people will naturally try and use close when they pull back with this kind of posture. So let's have a look what happens when we do that. Again, this is just strength. It's just pure strength against a pure weight. So when we read those old wushu manuals where they're saying don't use your strength, and people are still arguing about this idea, well, it doesn't mean that you don't use muscles. It doesn't mean that you don't use your physical body. It just means that you don't actually need all of your strength to do stuff like this. This relies on short, sharp movement, not overwhelming physical strength. Which obviously isn't to say that strength doesn't matter. And I remember having this conversation with my coach, and he was saying, well, even if you get stronger, there's still different ways that you can use your physical strength. And he also said that in each one we emphasize explosive movement, and the issue isn't how strong you are, but what happens if you meet an opponent who's much stronger than you. You know, we know there's limits. You're not going to knock out an elephant, but there are things that you can do by using your body differently. And this is, if you don't know, how Wang Shangjai began thinking about it, because after he became an adult and he started on his revolutionary martial arts journey, he didn't start with thinking about standing pole. He started by thinking about weight training. But after a period of doing weight training, he realised that no matter how strong he got, he would never be as strong as a much bigger Westerner. So in martial arts terms, if you're just relying on physical strength as the answer, then you might as well give up, because you can never win that game. And the answer also wasn't just to use Fa Li, it was to disrupt their structure first, just momentarily use fast explosive movement to disrupt their structure and then hit them in that moment. And that's very different to Xing Yiquan, for example. So they're not the same across Yiquan and Xing Yiquan. It's a significantly different concept. Xing Yiquan doesn't emphasize that idea of disrupting someone's structure first. A Beng Chuan, for example, a Pi Chuan, these are just strikes using Fa Li. You don't attack, disrupt, unbalance the opponent's structure and then hit them. They're not compounded movements like that, like they are in Yiquan, certainly as Wang Shangjai describes it. None of which is to say don't work on strength, and none of which is to say don't work on things like wrestling postures, and none of which is to say that you can't compound these kind of movement concepts with wrestling concepts. Of course you can do that. It's about seeing different ways and degrees of using the body, and there's a whole area of movement where you would never effectively move a whole person's structure, their whole physical weight, but nevertheless there's a range of really useful structural disruption techniques that you can use in that situation. And that, for example, is one of the things that we're really trying to train in push hands. And that brings me back to Wang Shangjai's idea that in any double-handed posture there's a dominant hand and a non-dominant hand, and you can actually switch between those two. If you switch between the A setting and the B setting, you can switch between those two. I don't want to confuse things talking about which is the A setting and the B setting when we pull back, but let's say we've looked at using open. Now we need to think about, well, what happens if we use close, so pulling the big weight using close. I'm just going to show the variation where you throw it to the side that your lead leg is on, because what I want to look at really is just how it affects the posture itself. So obviously you can throw it to either side. So because I'm throwing it to the lead leg, left hand side, it's still lead hand dominant, but it's an orthodox B setting because I'm using close. You can see my right leg move towards the left hip. And if you look carefully, you can see how I'm trying to get a little Farley snap into the hips, but the weight is so heavy that it's really testing the ability of the structure to contain that force. And remember that most martial arts don't have this concept of A settings and B settings, and even in Yiquan, for the most part, it's just something that's trained intuitively by training push hands and striking. But every martial art uses them to some degree. But in most cases, they'll just do what they're used to doing or what feels strongest. And this is a very good example because it feels strongest to use the B setting and pull someone over to the side like this. But also don't forget, when you pull on someone's head, if they aren't expecting it and they don't resist, actually it's a lot easier than pulling their whole body weight, because you're just pulling the top bit of their body over their feet so they imbalance. But if they do expect it, then they can resist it pretty easy. Then it is a battle of strength, and if you even do manage to move them, then you create this oppositional force effect. So anyway, the point I want to make is when you try and use all of your strength, it lifts you right up off your root. So that centrifugal force lifts you up off the floor and it makes you really vulnerable. And that's why in push hands, we shouldn't be thinking in those terms, those wrestling kind of terms. We should be thinking about, nor should we be thinking in those terms of fixed step push hands. We should be thinking about fluid footwork that can help to contain some of that oppositional force, and using those short movements that don't actually require massive amounts of physical strength to make them work.